The stage-coach lurched violently as it hit another rut, nearly throwing Margaret Price into the lap of the elderly woman sitting opposite her. It was the final insult in what had already been a journey from hell, 3 weeks of constant delays, broken wheels, and now this mad dash across the New Mexico territory with the horrifying knowledge that she was already 4 days late to her own wedding. First time out west, dear. The elderly woman smiled kindly, seemingly untroubled by the bone-jarring ride. Margaret clutched her small leather-bound journal tighter against her chest and nodded, trying to swallow the panic rising in her throat. Yes, madam, I was supposed to be in Silver Creek 4 days ago. Mail-order bride? The woman asked without judgment. Margaret nodded again, her cheeks flushing. At 22, she had never imagined this would be her fate, traveling halfway across the country to marry a man she'd never met, armed with nothing but a handful of letters and a daguerreotype of a stern-faced cowboy named Mason Vance. Don't you worry, the woman patted Margaret's knee. Men out here are desperate enough for wives that he'll still be waiting, mark my words. The year was 1871, and the West was no place for a Boston-bred schoolteacher like Margaret. But after her father's death left her penniless, and at the mercy of relatives who made it clear she was a burden, answering the advertisement in the matrimonial news had seemed like her only option. We're coming into Silver Creek, the driver shouted as the stagecoach began to slow. Margaret peered anxiously through the dusty window. Silver Creek appeared as a collection of wooden buildings strung along a wide main street, nothing like the bustling Boston neighborhood she'd left behind. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of what appeared to be a general store, and Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This is it, she whispered to herself, gathering her meager belongings, one carpetbag and a small trunk, containing everything she now owned in the world. The driver helped her down, and Margaret stood in the swirling dust of the main street, the late afternoon sun beating down on her travel-worn blue dress. She clutched the letter with instructions to meet her, intended at the church at noon on Tuesday 4 days ago. Panic seized her as she realized she had no idea where to go or what to do now. Miss Price. A deep voice called from behind her. Margaret turned to see a tall man with broad shoulders approaching, her breath caught in her throat. He matched the daguerreotype she carried, but the picture hadn't captured the intensity of his blue eyes or the way the sun brought out golden highlights in his brown hair. Mason Vance was more handsome than she'd expected, and that only added to her mortification. Mr. Vance, she said, lowering her eyes. I must apologize for my tardiness. The journey was fraught with delays, and you're right on time for me, he interrupted, his voice gentler than she'd imagined from his letters. Margaret looked up, confused. But the wedding was 4 days ago. I've ruined everything. Mason smiled, and the stern face from the photograph transformed. The wedding wasn't real, Miss Price, just something I put in the letter so folks in town wouldn't gossip too much before you arrived. He stepped closer, taking her carpetbag from her trembling hand. I figured you deserved a chance to meet me first before making any decisions about marriage. Relief washed over Margaret, followed by confusion. But your advertisement said I was looking for a wife, which I am. He shrugged those broad shoulders. But I never said anything about forcing a woman to marry me sight unseen the moment she stepped off the coach. For the first time since leaving Boston, Margaret felt something other than fear or regret. This man was nothing like what she'd expected. Let me get your trunk, Mason said, nodding to the driver who was unloading the baggage. I've arranged for you to stay with Mrs. Hollister, the widow who runs the boarding house, proper and respectable, just as you'd want. After you've rested, maybe we could talk about what happens next. As they walked down the dusty street, Mason carrying her trunk as if it weighed nothing, Margaret studied him from the corner of her eye. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, nodding respectfully to passers-by. I own a small ranch about 3 miles outside of town, he explained. Nothing fancy, but the land's good and the creek never runs dry, even in summer. Why did you place an advertisement for a bride, Mr. Vance? Margaret asked, finding her voice at last. Mason glanced at her, then looked ahead. Honest answer, a man gets lonely, and there aren't many unmarried women in these parts who aren't looking to move east, not stay west. I want to build something here. Need a partner for that. He paused. Your letters were different. You wrote about books and ideas. Seemed like you had a mind of your own. They arrived at a neat two-story house with a sign reading Hollister Boarding House swinging from the porch. Before they could climb the steps, the door flew open, revealing a plump woman with kind eyes. Finally. The woman exclaimed, Mason's been checking with the stage office every day since you were due. I'm Esther Hollister, dear. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted. Margaret was whisked inside, her belongings following, and shown to a small but clean room with a window overlooking a kitchen garden. Mrs. Hollister insisted she rest before dinner, and Margaret gratefully sank onto the bed once alone. She hadn't expected such a welcome, nor such consideration from her intended husband. The next morning, after the first good sleep she'd had in weeks, Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through her window. She dressed in her second-best dress, a green calico that had seen better days but was at least clean, and ventured downstairs to find Mason already waiting in Mrs. Hollister's parlor. I thought I might show you Silver Creek today, he said, standing when she entered, if you're feeling up to it. I would like that, Margaret replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Silver Creek was larger than it had appeared from the stagecoach window. Mason showed her the general store, the bank, the small schoolhouse, and introduced her to what seemed like half the town's population. Everyone greeted her warmly, though she noticed curious glances and a few knowing smiles. They all know why I'm here, don't they? She asked as they paused outside the milliner's shop. Small towns don't have many secrets, Mason admitted, but no one's judging. Half the marriages out here started with letters or advertisements. And what about the church? Margaret asked. The one where I was supposed to meet you 4 days ago. Mason hesitated, then nodded toward a white wooden building at the end of the street. That's it there. Pastor Miller comes through once a month, but he's not due back for another 2 weeks. As they approached the simple church, Margaret felt her nervousness return. So even if I had arrived on time, we'd still be waiting for the pastor, Mason finished with a smile. Like I said, you're right on time for me. The church was unlocked. As Mason explained most buildings in town were. They stepped into the cool, dim interior, the only light filtering through plain glass windows. Simple wooden pews faced a modest altar. This is where we'd be married, Mason said quietly, if that's what you decide you want. Margaret turned to look at him, studying the honest face of this man who was still a stranger to her. I don't know what I want yet, Mr. Vance. Mason, he corrected gently, and that's fair enough. I don't expect you to decide anything today or tomorrow. We have time. They left the church and continued their tour, ending at a small cafe where Mason insisted on buying her lunch. Over a simple meal of stew and fresh bread, Margaret found herself telling him about Boston, about teaching at a girls' school until her father's death, about the coldness of her aunt and uncle who had made it clear she was a burden they hadn't wanted. And what about you? She asked, realizing he had shared little of himself. How did a man like you end up alone in Silver Creek? Mason's eyes grew distant. I came west after the war. Wasn't much left for me in Virginia. My family's farm was gone and I couldn't stomach going back to the ruins. He absently twisted a napkin in his strong hands. Worked as a ranch hand for a few years, saved every penny, bought my place 3 years ago. The war changed many things, Margaret said softly, thinking of her own father who had never fully recovered from his time as an army surgeon. It did, Mason agreed. But out here a man can start fresh. That's what I aimed to do. Over the next week, a pattern emerged. Mason would arrive at the boarding house after breakfast and they would spend the day together. He showed her his ranch, a modest spread with a sturdy cabin, a barn and fields where cattle grazed. He introduced her to his closest neighbors, the Petersons, whose teenage sons helped with the ranch work. In the evenings, they would return to town, and Mason would bid her good night at Mrs. Hollister's door. Margaret found herself growing comfortable in his company. Mason was quiet but thoughtful, and when he did speak, he revealed an intelligence that surprised her. He had books in his cabin: history, philosophy, even poetry, and admitted to reading by lamplight during the long winter evenings. "Not what you expected from a cowboy?" he asked when she expressed surprise at finding a volume of Emerson among his possessions. "I'm learning not to expect anything," Margaret replied honestly. "You're not what I imagined when I answered your advertisement. Is that good or bad?" he asked with a half smile. "Good," she said firmly. "Definitely good." On her 10th day in Silver Creek, Margaret was helping Mrs. Hollister hang laundry when the older woman broached the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them all. "So," Mrs. Hollister said casually, pinning a sheet to the line, "have you given any thought to Mason's proposal? The whole town's wondering." Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm. "We haven't discussed marriage since I arrived." Mrs. Hollister nodded approvingly. "That's Mason for you. Won't rush a woman. But you should know he's been turning down dinner invitations from half the eligible ladies in the county for 2 years, waiting for you." "Not me specifically," Margaret corrected. "He didn't know me. He was waiting for anyone who answered his advertisement." "Maybe at first," Mrs. Hollister conceded, "but after your letters started coming, he was different. Started fixing up that cabin of his, built a proper fence around the kitchen garden that had been sitting empty, even put in bookshelves." She handed Margaret another pin. "A man doesn't do those things for just anyone." That evening when Mason came to collect her for their usual walk, Margaret found herself studying him more carefully. He'd trimmed his beard and wore a clean shirt with his usual denim pants and leather vest. He wasn't a talkative man, but he listened to everything she said as if it mattered. "Would you like to see the sunset from Miller's Ridge?" he asked as they left the boarding house. "It's not far and the view is worth the walk." Miller's Ridge turned out to be a gentle slope overlooking the valley where Silver Creek nestled. As the sun began to sink toward the distant mountains, painting the sky in spectacular oranges and purples, Mason spread his coat on a flat rock and gestured for her to sit. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed, taking in the wild grandeur of the landscape. Boston had its charms, but nothing like this untamed magnificence. "This is what made me want to stay," Mason said quietly. "First time I saw this view, I knew I wanted to build a life here." "I can understand why," Margaret replied, surprised to find she meant it. The West was growing on her in ways she hadn't expected. "Margaret," Mason began, his voice serious, "I know we haven't talked about the reason you came here, but I think it's time we did." Her heart skipped a beat. "You mean marriage?" he nodded, turning to face her fully. "I want you to know that my offer still stands, but I'll understand if you've changed your mind. Silver Creek might not be what you hoped for." "What did you hope for, Mason?" she asked. "When you sent for a bride," he looked out at the sunset, considering his answer. "Companionship. Someone to share the work and the quiet evenings. Children eventually." He glanced at her, then away. "But now that I've met you, I want more than that. I want you to be happy here, not just settling because you have nowhere else to go." The honesty in his words touched her. "I was afraid," she admitted. "When I got on that stagecoach in Boston, I was terrified I was making a terrible mistake. But now," he prompted when she hesitated. "Now I think I might have found something I wasn't even looking for." She met his gaze steadily. "I like you, Mason Vance. I like the life you're building here. I think I could be happy sharing it with you." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Are you saying yes?" "I'm saying I'm willing to try," Margaret clarified. "If you're willing to be patient with a city girl who still jumps at coyote howls." Mason laughed, a rich sound that made her smile in return. "I've got all the patience in the world for you, Margaret Price." As they walked back to town in the gathering twilight, Mason tentatively took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, the touch sending a pleasant shiver up her arm. "Pastor Miller will be here next Tuesday," he said. Would that be too soon? Margaret considered. They had known each other less than 2 weeks, and yet she felt she understood this quiet, thoughtful man better than many she had known for years. Tuesday would be fine, she decided. But Mason, I should warn you, I know nothing about being a rancher's wife. He squeezed her hand gently. And I know nothing about being a schoolteacher's husband. We'll learn together. The next few days passed in a flurry of preparations. News of their impending wedding spread through Silver Creek like wildfire, and suddenly Margaret found herself the recipient of advice, hand-me-down household items, and invitations to every home in the area. Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor's wife, insisted Margaret use her daughter's wedding dress. "She's back east with her husband now, and it's just gathering dust in my trunk. Would make an old woman happy to see it worn again." The dress needed some alterations, which the ladies of Silver Creek tackled with enthusiasm during an impromptu sewing circle at the boarding house. Margaret, who had always considered herself reasonably skilled with a needle, was amazed at the deft handwork of these frontier women who could transform a garment, while simultaneously discussing everything from crop yields to childbirth remedies. Mason, meanwhile, was busy at the ranch, preparing for his bride. Margaret visited twice during that week and was touched to find he had expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and enlarging the kitchen. He had even planted flowers around the front porch. "Marigolds," he explained almost sheepishly when she exclaimed over them. "Seemed fitting, given your name." The day before the wedding, a complication arose. Word came that Pastor Miller had broken his leg and wouldn't make it to Silver Creek for his monthly visit after all. The town buzzed with the news, and Margaret found herself strangely disappointed. "We could wait until next month," Mason suggested when he came to the boarding house that evening, hat in hand and concern in his eyes. Margaret shook her head. "Unless you've changed your mind, I haven't changed mine, but I don't see how we can proceed without the pastor." "Judge Parker could do it," Mrs. Hollister suggested, appearing from the kitchen where she had undoubtedly been eavesdropping. "He's performed marriages before when the pastor couldn't make it." And so it was settled. They would be married by the circuit judge who happened to be in Silver Creek hearing disputes over water rights. Not the church wedding Margaret had imagined, but somehow fitting for this unexpected journey her life had taken. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Margaret was awakened by a chorus of women invading her room at the boarding house, led by Mrs. Hollister and including Mrs. Peterson and several others she had met during her short time in town. "Can't have a bride getting ready on her own," declared Mrs. Peterson, laying out the altered wedding dress on the bed. It was a simple creation of ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, modest but lovely. The women fussed over Margaret's hair, arranging it in an elegant knot adorned with small white flowers from Mrs. Hollister's garden. They laughed and shared stories of their own weddings, some formal affairs back east, others hasty ceremonies performed in frontier settings far more primitive than Silver Creek. "My Henry and I were married under a cottonwood tree with Indians watching from the ridge above," recalled gray-haired Mrs. Thompson, who ran the town's small restaurant. "We had to pause the ceremony when a rattlesnake decided to join the congregation." As the morning progressed, Margaret felt a growing sense of calm certainty. This wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but somehow it felt right. She was choosing this path, not just accepting it as her only option. At noon, a knock came at the door of her room. Mrs. Hollister opened it to reveal Margaret's elderly traveling companion from the stagecoach. "I heard there was a wedding today," the woman said with a smile. "Thought the bride might need this." She held out a small blue velvet pouch. "Something borrowed. It was my grandmother's." Inside was a delicate pearl hairpin, which the women immediately declared perfect and added to Margaret's coiffure. "Thank you," Margaret said, touched by the gesture from someone who was almost a stranger. "You'll do just fine out here," the woman assured her. I can always tell who's got the backbone for it. By 1 o'clock, Margaret was dressed and ready. The wedding was to take place in the town square under the large oak tree that provided shade for community gatherings. As Mrs. Hollister led her from the boarding house, Margaret was astonished to see what seemed like the entire population of Silver Creek gathered. Chairs had been arranged in rows, and someone had constructed a simple arbor decorated with wildflowers. A fiddler was playing softly, and children darted about in their Sunday best. At the front stood Mason, looking almost unrecognizable in a dark suit, his hair neatly combed and his beard trimmed. Beside him was a portly man Margaret assumed must be Judge Parker. When Mason saw her, his face transformed with a smile of such genuine joy that Margaret felt her heart skip. This was no longer a practical arrangement between strangers. Somewhere in these few short weeks, something deeper had taken root. With no father to give her away, Margaret walked alone toward her future husband, conscious of every eye upon her but focused only on Mason's steady gaze. When she reached him, he held out his hand, and she took it without hesitation. "Dearly beloved," Judge Parker began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in matrimony." The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They exchanged simple vows, promising to honor and cherish each other. When Mason placed a plain gold band on her finger, another surprise. As she hadn't known he had purchased a ring, his hands trembled slightly, and Margaret felt her own eyes grow moist. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Parker declared. "You may kiss your bride." Mason leaned down, his kiss gentle and somewhat hesitant in front of the crowd. But even that brief contact sent warmth spreading through Margaret's body, and she found herself looking forward to more private moments when they could explore this new aspect of their relationship. The wedding celebration that followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced in Boston. Tables were set up in the square, laden with food contributed by every household in town. The fiddler was joined by other musicians, and dancing commenced with enthusiasm. Mason, it turned out, was surprisingly light on his feet for such a solid man, and Margaret found herself laughing as he twirled her around the makeshift dance floor. As the afternoon wore on, various townspeople approached to offer congratulations and advice, some helpful, some humorous, and some decidedly inappropriate, especially after the homemade whiskey began flowing freely. "Don't mind them," Mason murmured in her ear after a particularly colorful suggestion from one of the ranch hands. "They mean well." "I'm not shocked," Margaret assured him with a smile. "I taught at a girls' school, remember." "Young women aren't as innocent in their discussions as men might believe," he laughed, the sound warming her heart. "You're full of surprises, Mrs. Vance." The new name startled her momentarily, but she found she liked the sound of it. Mrs. Vance. Margaret Vance. It had a strength to it that suited her new home. As sunset approached, Mason caught her eye across the celebration. "Ready to go home?" he asked quietly when she made her way to his side. Home. Such a simple word, but it held such meaning. Margaret nodded, suddenly nervous about what came next, but also eager to begin their life together. They made their farewells amid good-natured teasing and well wishes. Mason had brought a wagon to take them and Margaret's belongings to the ranch. As they rode through the gathering dusk, Margaret beside him on the seat, she felt a curious mixture of anticipation and peace. "Nervous?" Mason asked, seeming to read her thoughts. "A little," she admitted. "It's been a whirlwind few weeks," he nodded. "We can take it slow, Margaret. Get to know each other better." The thoughtfulness of his words reassured her. This was a man who would respect her feelings, who would be patient and kind. The ranch house glowed with lamplight as they approached, and Margaret realized someone must have come ahead to prepare for their arrival. When Mason helped her down from the wagon, she noticed more lights in the barn and outbuildings. "The Peterson boys," Mason explained, following her gaze. "They'll take care of the evening chores so we don't have to worry about anything tonight." He carried her trunk inside and Margaret followed, stepping into what was now her home. The cabin was simple but comfortable, with the new additions Mason had built giving it more space than she had initially thought. A fire burned cheerfully in the stone hearth, and the table was set with what appeared to be a cold supper and a bottle of wine. "Mrs. Peterson's doing," Mason said with a smile. "She said we wouldn't want to be cooking tonight." The thoughtfulness of these people who had been strangers just weeks ago brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "Everyone has been so kind. You'll find that's the way it is out here," Mason said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "People look out for each other. Have to survive." After they had eaten, the awkwardness Margaret had feared began to creep in. Mason cleared the dishes, his movements betraying his own nervousness. "Would you like to see the rest of the house?" he asked, clearly trying to ease the tension. Margaret nodded, grateful for the distraction. He showed her the pantry, well stocked with preserved foods for the coming winter, and the second bedroom he had begun preparing. "For children someday," he said, a question in his voice. "If you want them." "I do," Margaret assured him. "I always imagined having a family of my own." The tour ended in the main bedroom, where her trunk had been placed at the foot of a sturdy bed covered with a colorful quilt. Mason hesitated in the doorway. "I can sleep in the front room tonight if you'd prefer," he offered. "Give you time to adjust." Margaret took a deep breath, then turned to face him. "We're married now, Mason. This is your bed too." The relief in his eyes was evident, and Margaret realized he had been as uncertain as she was about how to proceed. That shared vulnerability gave her courage. "Perhaps," she suggested, "you could help me with these buttons. Mrs. Peterson did them up so tightly I'm not sure I can manage alone." Mason stepped closer, his fingers surprisingly deft as they worked at the tiny buttons running down the back of her wedding dress. When the last one was undone, he stepped back, giving her space. "I'll just give you a moment," he said, turning to leave the room. Margaret caught his hand. "Don't go far," she whispered. Their first night together was a gentle discovery, Mason's reverence for her body making her feel treasured in a way she had never expected. He was patient and attentive, and though there was some discomfort at first, it gave way to pleasure that left her breathless and wondering why proper Boston ladies spoke of marital duties as something to be endured rather than enjoyed. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Margaret felt a contentment that went bone deep. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked, stroking her hair that now fell loose around her shoulders. "That I'm glad I was late for our wedding," she replied honestly. "If I'd arrived on time, we might have been married by a stranger before we even had a chance to know each other." He chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly under her ear. "Everything happens for a reason, I guess." "Do you believe that?" she asked, propping herself up to look at him in the dim light of the single lamp they had left burning. "I do now," he said, touching her cheek with gentle fingers. "After the war, I didn't believe in much of anything good, but finding this place and now you makes me think maybe there's a plan after all." They fell asleep tangled together, and Margaret dreamed of wide open spaces and endless possibilities. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as Margaret learned the workings of the ranch and her role in it. Mason was patient, teaching her everything from how to collect eggs without upsetting the hens to the basics of riding horseback. She proved a quick study, determined to be a true partner in this endeavor. Her first attempts at cooking on a wood stove were less successful, resulting in several charred meals that Mason gallantly consumed without complaint. But Mrs. Peterson rode over regularly to offer advice, and soon Margaret was mastering the art of frontier cooking, even experimenting with the wild herbs that grew in abundance around the property. A month into their marriage, Mason returned from a trip to town with a surprise, a small upright piano he had purchased from a family moving back east. "You mentioned in one of your letters that you played," he explained as the Peterson boys helped maneuver the instrument into place in their front room. "Thought it might make you feel more at home." Margaret was speechless, overcome by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. She had indeed mentioned her love of music, but only in passing in one of their early exchanges. That he had remembered and gone to the expense of buying the piano touched her deeply. That evening, after the chores were done, she played for him. Simple tunes and hymns she remembered from her childhood. Mason sat in his chair by the fire, watching her with such contentment that Margaret felt a surge of emotion unlike anything she had ever experienced before. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words coming unbidden but true. Mason's eyes widened, and then the slow smile she had come to cherish spread across his face. "I've loved you since your second letter," he admitted. "The one where you talked about wanting to see the stars without city lights dimming them." He came to sit beside her on the piano bench, taking her hands in his. "I was afraid you might never feel the same, that you might always see this as just the better of bad options." Margaret shook her head. "It stopped being that the moment you told me I was right on time for you. Nobody had ever made me feel like I was exactly where I belonged before." Their kiss was deeper than those they had shared before, filled with the certainty of their feelings for each other. When they finally broke apart, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I want to build something good with you, Margaret, something that lasts." "We already are," she assured him. As autumn turned to winter, their bond deepened. The first snow found them well prepared. The root cellar stocked with preserved vegetables and fruits, the smokehouse full of meat, and the woodpile high enough to last through the coldest months. The ranch was snug and warm, and Margaret discovered the joy of long winter evenings spent reading aloud by lamplight or simply talking about their hopes and dreams. Mason spoke more openly now about his experiences during the war, the horrors he had witnessed as a young cavalry officer fighting for the Confederacy, and his disillusionment with the cause as the conflict dragged on. Margaret shared stories of her own father's struggles after returning from the battlefield as a Union surgeon, the common ground of their shared pain bridging what might have once been an insurmountable political divide. They had their disagreements, of course. Margaret's Eastern ideas sometimes clashed with Mason's frontier pragmatism. But they learned to listen to each other, to find compromise, and often discovered their different perspectives strengthened their decisions. Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers and new life on the ranch. Margaret had taken over care of the kitchen garden, expanding it to include herbs and flowers as well as vegetables. She had also begun helping with the ranch's accounts, her education proving valuable as Mason considered expanding their cattle herd. "I was thinking," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "about the schoolhouse in town." "What about it?" Mason asked, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "Mrs. Thompson mentioned they're looking for a teacher. The last one left to get married last fall, and the children have been without proper schooling all winter." Mason turned to look at her. "You want to teach again? Just 3 days a week," she clarified quickly. "I wouldn't neglect my duties here." "Margaret," he said seriously, "you don't need my permission. If it's something you want to do, you should do it. The ranch can spare you." His support warmed her heart. "I would need to ride into town alone those days. Are you sure you wouldn't mind?" he chuckled. "You've become a fine horsewoman. I trust you to make the journey safely. Besides," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "it would give the town something new to gossip about besides whether or not you're in the family way yet." Margaret blushed. They had been trying for a baby since their wedding night, but so far without success. "Do they really talk about that? Small towns," Mason shrugged. "Not much else to discuss." 2 weeks later, Margaret found herself standing in front of 12 children ranging in age from 6 to 15, the new teacher at Silver Creek's one-room schoolhouse. The work was challenging but rewarding, and she found great satisfaction in adapting her Boston teaching methods to the needs of these frontier children. On her rides home, Margaret often marveled at the turn her life had taken. If someone had told her a year ago that she would be happily married to a rancher in New Mexico territory, teaching in a one-room schoolhouse and learning to birth calves in her spare time, she would have thought them mad. Yet here she was, more content than she had ever imagined possible. Summer brought the cattle drive, a time of intense work for Mason and the hired hands. Margaret kept the ranch running in his absence, proving to herself and the neighboring wives that she had indeed adapted to frontier life. When Mason returned, dusty and exhausted but successful in his sales, the reunion was sweet enough to make the separation worthwhile. It was in the golden days of early autumn, almost exactly a year after her arrival in Silver Creek, that Margaret's monthly cycle failed to appear. After 2 weeks of hopeful waiting, she visited Dr. Wilson in town, who confirmed what she had begun to suspect: she was with child. She kept the news to herself for a few days, savoring the secret and planning how to tell Mason. Finally, on a crisp evening when they were enjoying the last of the good weather on their porch, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said simply, watching his face for his reaction. The joy that spread across his features was answer enough, but his words made her heart swell even further. "Thank you," he whispered, pulling her close, "for coming west, for being late to our wedding, for giving me a family." "Thank you for waiting for me," she replied, nestling against his chest, "for giving me the time to choose this life, not just accept it." The baby arrived the following spring, a healthy boy they named Michael, after Margaret's father. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth, and 3 years after that by another son, James. The Vance ranch prospered and expanded, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Margaret continued teaching until her family duties made it impractical, but she never regretted the choice to focus on her children and the ranch. As the years passed, Silver Creek grew from a small frontier settlement into a proper town, with a railway station, a bank, and eventually even a small college where Margaret taught literature to young women seeking education before marriage or careers. Mason served on the town council and later as mayor, his quiet wisdom and fairness making him respected throughout the region. They weathered droughts and blizzards, economic downturns and personal losses. They buried Mrs. Hollister and later Mrs. Peterson, mourning these women who had welcomed Margaret and taught her the ways of her new home. They celebrated their children's achievements and supported them through disappointments, always providing a solid foundation of love and respect. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire town turned out for a celebration in the square where they had been married. Their children, now adults with lives and dreams of their own, arranged for a photographer to capture the family gathered under the same oak tree, now much larger, where Mason and Margaret had exchanged their vows. That night, after the festivities had ended and they were alone in the ranch house that had expanded over the years but still retained the cozy heart of the original cabin, Mason took Margaret's hand as they sat by the fire. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Coming west, marrying a stranger." Margaret looked at the man beside her, his hair now streaked with silver but his blue eyes still bright with the same steadfast love she had come to depend on. She thought of the life they had built together, the children they had raised, the joys and sorrows they had shared. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "Being late to our wedding was the best mistake I ever made." Mason smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way that still made her heart skip. "You were right on time for me," he repeated the words he had said all those years ago. "You always have been." As they sat together watching the flames dance in the hearth, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west seeking security and found love instead. She had arrived late for a wedding only to discover she was perfectly on time for the life that was meant to be hers all along. In this man's patient heart, she had found her true home, and in his steadfast love, she had found the courage to become more than she had ever dreamed possible. And as Mason leaned over to kiss her, with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding night, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that some journeys, no matter how delayed or difficult, lead exactly where they are meant to.